Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming. Paulette sends her regards. She is at a history conference this week, which is why she's not here, but I'm sure she'll have lots of interesting information to share with us when she returns for next month's meeting, which, by the way, is on Western Montana Restricted Districts, more colloquially known as Black Light Districts of Missoula. So that will be a fun one. Last Friday in October, I believe that's the 27th. Anyway, so just come on by to that. And then without any further ado, I'll just introduce our speaker. So, Larry Mylnechuk, BA, JD, is a retired educator and arbitrator who has spent close to 40 years researching American history. He's a 30-year member of Sons of the American Revolution and most recently served as Vice President General of the Intermountain District. Larry is very proud of his Revolutionary War ancestors and current distant family members who are fighting for their freedom in Ukraine.
Okay. Can everyone hear me okay? I'm honored to be here tonight. I'm a fill-in, but I'll try to make good on it, okay? Thank you so much for coming. I want to thank all of you, both new and long-term history group members, for being here. And if you're not a history group member, you should be, okay? I also want to take note and thank very much. We have a table here tonight on my right who are visiting us from the University of Montana ROTC program. Would you raise your hands, please, ladies and gentlemen? That's our future, okay? Well, ladies and gentlemen, what I'm going to talk about tonight is something near and dear that many of you know something about. It's about perhaps the most daring, dangerous, and desperate air raid ever pulled off by the U.S. Army Air Corps in early 1942. And it involves some Montana boys in it. I say boys because most of these young men were just out of high school. And they were risking their lives on a desperate mission. We're going to talk primarily tonight about one of them, David.Thatcher. You may have passed by the David.Thatcher VA Health Center out on Broadway going toward the airport, named in his honor. But I don't know if you know everything this guy did and some of the other men around him, because it was just awesome. We're going to talk about that tonight, and I'm going to ask you to do something. I want you to assume that you've been asked to volunteer for a very dangerous mission. How dangerous? Well, you have to be a volunteer. The military won't even order you to do this. How dangerous? You can back out at any time with no repercussions. Now that sounds pretty darn serious. And that's what these men experienced. But what they didn't know was that if any one thing in the mission went wrong, it was an absolute suicide mission for these young aviators in World War II. We're going to start by taking you back to something you either know or have read about, and that's the sneak attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. The Imperial Japanese Command authorized this sneak attack to neutralize our Pacific Fleet in anticipation of being able to attack the West Coast within 6 to 12 months. And we would have nothing on the ocean to defend against that attack. The author of that attack was Fleet Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who was very, very well trained and had been a military attaché in Washington before the war. And he told the Japanese High Command, don't do this. Don't attack America. It's foolhardy. And they basically told him, Admiral, you're a soldier, do your duty. He said, okay, but here's the punchline. If we attack Pearl Harbor, I can guarantee 6 to 12 months of victories in the Pacific. If by the end of that time, America is not at the negotiating table suing for peace, all bets are off. Because if the Americans get a chance to get their war machine going, there's no chance we can defeat them. So it has to be all or nothing right away. Well, that attack was devastatingly successful. It neutralized all our capital ships, most of our surface fleet, and left us with only some submarines and a couple of aircraft carriers to defend the whole Pacific Ocean. And that's a big ocean. Japan, on the other hand, had a fleet 2 to 3 times the size, at least 6 fleet aircraft carriers, and they had the best pilots and, frankly, the best airplanes at the time at their disposal. So we were in dire, dire straits. So what were we going to do? Well, ladies and gentlemen, the Pentagon at that time had just been built. It was just being, if you will, occupied. And the boys at the Pentagon, the brass, the high thinkers, if we will, said, we've got to strike back immediately. We've got to show the Japanese we're not on our knees in the Pacific. What can we do? Well, there wasn't a whole lot they could do. We have no bases left. We have our longest bomber range, the B-17 Flying Fortress, still wasn't quite enough to do what they need to do in terms of range to bomb Japan at that point in time. So they had to come up with, if you will, something that's out of the left pocket, something nobody else expected. And so they started thinking. And if you want to, ladies and gentlemen, you could turn to the first page of the stapled handout, and this is what they came up with. They had a brand new high-tech asset just coming online in the Army Air Force. It was the Mitchell B-25 bomber. It was an awesome high-tech weapon for its time. It had 2 14-cylinder, 1,700 horsepower engines that could propel it at the unheard of speed of 300 miles an hour. It could carry about 4,000 pounds of bombs. And if you look at the picture, it had machine guns sticking out all over it for defense. But guess what? It couldn't fly over the Pacific Ocean. They had to find a way to get it within range of Japan. So the planners at the Pentagon came up with this, we'll say, crazy idea. They were going to put as many of these B-25s as they could on the deck of an aircraft carrier and try to get it close enough to the Japanese mainland that they could bomb the home islands. Now, what was the, if you will, the mission? What was this all about? What are 16 or 20 medium bombers going to do to the home islands of Japan from a military standpoint? Well, the answer is virtually nothing in terms of damaging the war effort. But in 500 years of existence, the Japanese Empire had never had the home islands successfully attacked by any enemy, anywhere, anytime. And the Japanese High Command had assured the Japanese population, you're completely safe. These wimpy Americans can't get anywhere close to us to attack. Well, the Pentagon had other ideas, but you can see now this is a last-ditch program and a plan. It was something that looked good on the drawing boards, but nobody was sure it would ever work. Now, at that time, there were only a few squadrons of B-25s in military service around the United States. And there were only very few air crews that were trained really to use them properly. One was in the Pacific Northwest, and on one of the planes, the flight engineer was a young man named David.Thatcher from Bridger, Montana. He had graduated from high school in 1940, gone to air training school, become a flight engineer and a machine gunner on the new B-25. And you can turn the page on the handout, and you'll see a later picture. That's not David, but that's what it looked like to be a machine gunner on a bomber in World War II. You had these huge, gigantic 50 caliber machine guns, and later I have some rounds from those if you want to see how big they are. They were huge, and they were awesome, powerful. They could knock down a target as far as 2 miles away if the gunner could accurately shoot that far. Now, the 50 caliber Browning machine gun was first brought into military service in 1920. And ladies and gentlemen, modern variations of the 50 cal are still in use in our military today, a century later. That's how awesome this weapon has become. But at this time, it's brand new, never been used really in warfare at all. So the Pentagon said, call up all the operational B-25 squadrons, have them send their best air crews for secret training for this mission. And it's all volunteer. You can't tell them where they're going. You can't tell them what they're going to do. You can't tell them any details about it. All you can say is it's highly dangerous. Well, David.Thatcher and some other Montana boys, if you turn to the next picture, you'll see the flyleaf from the first edition of the book, 20 Seconds Over Tokyo. It's a pictorial which shows B-25s taking off from an aircraft carrier, bombing Japan, and then flying to friendly airfields deep in China, which was under attack by the Japanese too at this time. This is what they were going to do. But could they pull it off? What I'm going to do, I wanted you to assume that you've been asked to volunteer. I'm going to tell you what some of these guys went through, both in training and the actual mission. And I want to ask you, would you back out? Could you hang in there if you had agreed to go? Well, they flew at least 29 planes to a relatively obscure airfield, Eglin Airfield in Florida, out in the sticks at that time, because they didn't want any chance of the secret mission to leak. And the air crews were even billeted separately. They couldn't have any direct contact with other Air Corps personnel on base. They slept separately. They ate separately from everybody else. But the first thing that they walked in the door, their first few days, the ladies at the commissary said, "Oh boy, it's the suicide boys. They're here." Now, would that bring you confidence if you had volunteered for a mission like this? Well, they still went on. The leader of this mission, on the next page, I believe, was a feisty lieutenant colonel of the Army Air Corps and veteran flyer of the time, James Jimmy Doolittle. He was a bantamweight boxer in college. He was tough. He was unafraid. He knew a lot about technology, but he had another ace in the hole. In addition to being one of the nation's best test pilots at the time, he held one of the first doctorates in aerodynamics from MIT. So he was smart. And he was one of the ones who thought this might be possible. We might be able to pull this off if we train these air crews carefully. Okay? And if you look at the page after that, you can see what Jimmy did before the war. As I said, he was a test pilot, and he was trying to set speed records. At that time, they were trying to get to the unheard of speed of 300 miles an hour in level flight. And they had some red-hot 20s and 30s era aircraft that were designed to do it. That one's called the GB, and it was a death trap. As you can see, it's all engine, very little wing area, very little tail surface. It was designed to go fast and nothing else. But ladies and gentlemen, if the engine went out, you were flying a brick. It could not land unpowered. In fact, several test pilots lost their life in early variations of this particular aircraft. Jimmy was able to fly it. In fact, he set some speed records in this before World War II. And he learned some tricky things, like when you're landing, you never gun the engine on a GB because the engine is so powerful, it flips the airplane over like that, bang, and you're dead. So he learned very gently to put these things down on the airfield, but he knew what he was doing. He was able to do it. So the Pentagon tasked him with leading this desperate air raid on the Japanese mainland, not later than April of 1942. Okay, the guys have arrived at the airfield. And I think if you turn the page, there's a picture of David.Thatcher's air crew on plane number 8. He's on the far right. He was the flight engineer and machine gunner. I don't know in the right order who the other guys were. I think the guy second from left is the pilot, Ted Lawson. And Ted had already had one crash in a B-25 because, you know what? I don't know if you've ever heard this, but a lot of first-time military technology has bugs in it. Our brand new F-35 attack supersonic fighter, we just had another crash a week or so ago because what always works on the drawing board doesn't always work perfectly in flight. And so it was with the B-25s, the early ones off the assembly line. They had problems with their hydraulic systems. They had problems with their electrical systems. They had problems with the machine guns operating properly. But worst of all, they had a very serious problem. That was engines on the first variation tended to conk out in flight for no reason. And then you had one heck of a problem trying to get that airplane down on one engine. It wasn't meant to fly on one, certainly not with a bomb load. But anyway, this is David's crew. They're at Eglin Air Force Base, and there were a lot of shocks to come. This was just a start. If you want to turn the page one more, you'll get a picture of what says photo on the top. This was another piece of highest secret technology the United States had in World War II. This was the famous Norden bomb sight that we had in our planes. It was supposed to be better than any bomb sight on any plane in any nation over the world. It had adjustments for speed, adjustments for wind currents, altitude. And in fact, it was so complicated that the bombardier operating this machine actually flew the bomber for the final part of the bomb run. He took over from the pilot, and he flew the airplane through this machine. And it was just awesome. But again, top secret, ultra top secret at this time. And the B-25s at Eglin had first generation Norden bomb sights on them. They were equipped with these. Well, here starts the problem. One day, the air crews come out for training in their airplanes. No Norden bomb sights. They've been taken off the plane. And the pilots and the air crews, what did you do? What did you take those things off for? You aren't going to need these. Why not? Why aren't we going to need these? Well, trust us. The way you're going to have to run this bomb run, you're not going to need the Nordens. Well, what is it? Well, we won't tell you. But, okay, that's quite a shocker. They'd been trained on these. In fact, the air crews were told to protect these with their very lives. These were never to fall into enemy hands under any circumstances. But now they're gone. Okay, well, are you still with us? Are you still a volunteer now in the program? So the pilots and the bombardiers said, what can we use to drop the bomb? If not that, you can turn the page. They had some kind of ruler piece of cardboard. It was called the Doolittle 30-cent bomb sight. And the air crew said, what in the hell is this? They said, you're going to learn to bomb targets with this? And they said, with this? Yes. What they weren't being told was they were going to be flying so low to the ground that the Nordens wouldn't work. So they had a, what do you call it, a jimmy-rigged little 29-cent cardboard ruler bomb sight. And they started to practice using this thing, and it seemed to work pretty good. Now, are you still with the program? Are you going to back out yet? You haven't heard anything yet, ladies and gentlemen. One day, they come out. Now, the next picture is they come out, and all those beautiful machine guns that you saw sticking out of the B-25 in the early picture, they're gone. What's in their place? A bunch of sticks painted black to look like machine guns. And the crew said, what is going on here? Why did you strip our machine guns? They said, well, it decreases the range of your aircraft, and you need gas more than you need machine guns right now. They said, well, what if we run into enemy aircraft? They said, don't. Just don't run into them, okay? All right, are you still on board? Are you going to stay with this program, ladies and gentlemen? This is just a start. And then they were told they had to learn how to hop over trees. They were flying so low they had to go treetop level. And the B-25 wasn't really, if you will, designed for low-level bombing flight. They banged them up like crazy. And as a result, there's the next picture. Ted Lawson, who's the pilot in Thatcher's airplane and a sharp guy, got banged up in a lot of these training missions so bad that when they were given the opportunity to name their airplane, you know, some of the airplanes were named after beautiful women or heroes or something like that. Guess what he named their airplane? Oh, don't ask. It's the Ruptured Duck. because he got all busted up trying to fly that thing at low level. Okay, are you still with the program now? You're not going to back out yet? Oh, we still haven't even started. Okay. Well, after that, the crowning glory or test, if you will, was one day a naval officer shows up at base, Commander Miller. He's from the Pentagon. He said, gentlemen, I'm going to show you how to take a fully loaded B-25 off in 500 feet of runway. And the pilot said, you're full of you-know-what. It can't be done. The plane isn't designed to do that. He said, well, I can teach you how to do it. It can be done. And he said, okay, wise guy, show us. He said, well, I've never flown a B-25 before. This is an Army airplane. And they said, what? You've never flown one of these? You're going to tell us how we're going to fly these things? You've never been in one? He said, that's correct. But he had been part of the scientific studies to prove that it could be done, okay? So he started teaching him techniques for short takeoffs. Why are we doing this? We won't tell you. Where are we going? We won't tell you. Why do we have to do this? We won't tell you. But you can back out if you want. Well, they still stayed in there. Finally, after a little over a month of constant training, they were ordered to send their 16 best crews to California. And they flew by circuitous routes. They didn't fly as a squadron. And they made it to San Francisco Naval Air Station. And my God, they watched their planes being hooked up and loaded on top of an aircraft carrier. Their planes were so big, the wings stuck out over the edge of the aircraft carrier. This was not something that was, if you will, on the design plates at all. But 16 of the B-25s were loaded up. Their crews were invited on board. And when they left base, they were out in the ocean, they were finally told where they were going. You're going to bomb the Japanese homeland. Are you still on board, ladies and gentlemen? Are you still going to do it? Okay, well, this isn't the end of it, because while they're going through their last-minute briefings on the aircraft carrier, another Montana boy, Ed Saylor from Jordan Valley, who was a master mechanic at the time on the B-25, went to Colonel Doolittle and said, Colonel, I got bad news for you. He says the right engine on plane number is running so bad that plane will never make it to Japan. I've got to tear down that engine completely and rebuild it. And Doolittle said, here on the aircraft carrier? This is not a maintenance shed. He said, I got to do it or it won't fly. I know, sir. He said, well, you better get that damn thing back together before we have to take off, or I'm going to have to just dump it overseas. I can't take a risk on something like that. And Ed Saylor did tear down one of those 14-cylinder, 1,700 horsepower engines, put it back together on the deck of the aircraft carrier, and got it to run smoothly, if you will. Okay, now things are getting down to the final hours, folks. April 18th, 1942, our small task force is steaming toward Japan. In the early morning hours, they see what looks like a fishing boat, a Japanese fishing boat, on the horizon, and they think they've been spotted. So they immediately sink that fishing boat, but they don't know if it had a radio on them or not. If that little boat had a radio and radioed ahead to Japan, it would be a suicide mission, because the Japanese Air Force would be waiting for them when they went on their bomb run. But they kept going, and the colonel pulled the air crews into the briefing room and said, gentlemen, we got some issues to discuss, and I don't want to mamby-pamby you around. He said, we've just sunk a Japanese possible picket boat. We don't know. And if it did have a radio, we're in dire straits. I've got some other bad news for you, gentlemen. In order for this mission to be successful, we had to be within 400 miles of the Japanese coastline. Right now, we are 640 miles off Japan. If we take off now, you won't have fuel to reach your emergency airfields. You're going to have to crash land or bail out in occupied China. That's the only thing I can offer you. He said, you still have the chance to back out. Anybody can back out. I'm not going to order anyone on a mission like this? How many backed out? Nobody backed out, okay? And Doolittle said, I don't care, I'm going to bomb Japan. It's that important, I'm going to do it. Come with me if you will. They all voted to go. So later on, starting about 6 o'clock in the morning, and I think there's another picture in your packet, which is an actual archival photograph of one of the B-25s taking off from the USS Hornet on the way to Japan. They got them all off the carrier. Nobody crashed. And they were on their way. But this was just the start of it, ladies and gentlemen, because they had a very dangerous bomb run, and they didn't know how they were going to make it back alive after. Well, most of the planes made it to Japan safely. Most of the planes were able to drop their bombs on their assigned targets without getting shot down because the Japanese were completely unprepared for an air attack on the homeland. In fact, the word was the emperor was having lunch in his palace, and the guards came to get him and said, we got to get you downstairs in the bomb shelter, sir. Why? Because the Americans are bombing Tokyo. He said, you told me that could never happen. That's not supposed to happen. Well, it was happening, okay? So they got him down. The planes all made it over Japan pretty successfully, but now came the rough part. They were going to run short on gas. What were they going to do? At least one of the planes flew to China, or Russia, where it was impounded, because Russia at that time was still, we were still a neutral country in their eyes. We were still allies, if you will. But the crew had to wait till the end of the war. And most of the air crews, including Doolittle, had to get out of there, crash land, bail out their planes. Plane number 8, David.Thatcher's plane, and you can go to the second handout, the news release, the one-page news release. They were on the coast of China, and Ted Lawson said, I can't fly her any farther, we're out of gas. And he said, maybe I can put it down on the shallow beach on the coast of China. So they tried a crash landing. I mean, Ted Lawson was one of the best in the B-25. He put her down in the surf, and from what we can reconstruct, the plane either hit a big wave or an underwater obstacle and stopped like that in mid-flight almost. And Lawson and his co-pilot were ejected out the front windshield of the airplane, and the bomber flipped over on its back like that in the surf. Every member of the ruptured duck air crew was seriously injured except David.Thatcher. He got banged on the head pretty hard, but I guess he was in his engineering compartment, which evidently was a little better insulated from the shock of landing. He helped get all his fellow crewmen ashore who were desperately wounded, and then he swam back out to get the medical kit out of the B-25. And then on top of that, they were evidently spotted by some Chinese fishermen. But this was dangerous because the Japanese army was in control of this area. They had posts all over there, and some were evidently pretty close to where the ruptured duck went down. But Thatcher convinced the Chinese to help the air crew get to temporary safety, to be hidden somehow. And after that, for several weeks, in fact, he helped shuttle the injured air crew from hiding spot to hiding spot in China, and eventually they made it back to our side of the lines, and they were rescued. Now, during this time, Ted Lawson, the pilot, had injured his leg seriously, and they decided it had to be amputated right out there in the backlands of China with no modern facilities whatsoever. They were able to find another, or join up with another air crew that bailed out, and one of those was the doctor on purpose. They sent one doctor along on the mission. This was ultra lucky for Ted Lawson, because the doctor amputated his left leg in a shack in the Chinese backcountry, and he survived. It was almost a miracle. They finally got to, if you will, friendly territory where they were able to get help from allies. They could not fly back over the Pacific. The Japanese had total control of the Pacific Ocean early in the war. So there's no way, so they had to be taken clear around the world. They had to go to India, to Africa, West Africa, across the Atlantic Ocean, I think to Brazil by the shortest route, and then ferried back up to Washington, D.C. But most of them made it back alive. It was a miracle. And once again, there wasn't a lot of military damage done to the Japanese because of this raid, but it was an absolute shocker for the Imperial Japanese Command. And they had to bring more military assets back to defend the home islands, because if those damn Americans could pull something like this off once, they might do it again. And so from a psychological standpoint, the raid did achieve what the Pentagon wanted it to. It bought us some time to get our war machine up and going. And as you know, it was more than a year before we were even able to offer a formidable defense against the Japanese in the Pacific. And it wasn't until later in that year, in the Battle of Midway, in June 1942, that we finally returned the favor to the Japanese. We sunk all 4 of their fleet carriers that were attacking Midway Island. And had they been successful, there was nothing to stop them from being on the West Coast. But we did it, okay? Well, that's kind of interesting. Well, they get back to Washington, D.C. Colonel Doolittle is made a brigadier general. He's awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor for pulling this thing off. 'Cause I'm not sure he even thought they could, but he did it. David.Thatcher is awarded the Silver Star for getting his entire flight crew through enemy territory while injured to safety. Not only that, a short time later, Lawson is recovering in hospital because, of course, he's had his leg amputated. His face was very badly cut up in the crash, too. And he was a real technical kind of guy, decided he was going to write an account of this mission. And so within just a couple of months, he wrote the outline for a book. And it got published a year later. Title was 30 Seconds Over Tokyo. And there's a poster over there on the table for the later movie version. Well, this is 1942, early 1943. We need all the good news we can get. And a couple of Hollywood scriptwriters got together with Lawson, closeted in a hotel, I guess, for 4 days, and turned the book into a movie script for what we would now call a propaganda movie. And it was entitled also 30 Seconds Over Tokyo. It was, if you will, the biggest stars of the era were in the movie. Spencer Tracy, Van Johnson, Robert Mitchum, but David.Thatcher was in the movie too. He was portrayed by the actor Robert Walker, and it showed him getting his crew through China, trying to get them to safety and not have them being captured. Because the few crew members that were captured by the Japanese, guess what happened to them? No heads. That was what the Japanese did to their enemies in those days. But after they recovered, if you will, David went on to become a postman here in Missoula, Montana. And maybe I know some of you knew him or knew his children. He never bragged. He never said anything about what he did at that time. He just, I think, was happy to be out alive in one piece and back to Montana. Ed Saylor, the master mechanic that I told you about on the Hornet, stayed in the war also. He was given a battlefield commission in 1944 and lived to become, if you will, a commanding officer of an air maintenance crew in the U.S. Air Force. And I believe he died in 1993 and is buried in Tacoma in the military cemetery there. We have at least one other Montanan on the ruptured duck. We're still doing research on him, and that was the navigator, if I can get it right now. I don't even know if I have the right picture. But I don't know if he was from Montana, but it was McClure was his name, Lieutenant McClure. His nephew, if you will, still is a member of our Montana Sons of the American Revolution and told us a lot about what he did. I think he had to, if you will, bail out of the Air Corps right after World War II because he was horribly injured in the crash and unable to really continue active duty. But ladies and gentlemen, that is not the end of it. Not yet. David went on, as you know, to live a long life here in Missoula. And in 2016, when my wife and I retired back here, we say we came home to retire to Montana, we were forming the Liberty Tree chapter of the Sons of the American Revolution, which, by the way, is not a political group. We don't back candidates or ballot measures. We try to preserve history and talk about what our ancestors did to create the United States of America. Anyway, we were going to form a new chapter. And I got word that there was this gentleman from World War II who might be interested in joining. So I finally, not knowing who I was meeting, got to meet David when he was 94. And he was very frail, but still alert. And people were telling me, you got to understand what this man did. Well, I didn't at first. But we found out he had a patriot ancestor, Jacob Painter, who was a soldier in the Revolutionary War in Tennessee, fought for American independence. So we did David's family history for him. And in, I believe it was late February of 2016, via a telephonic hookup from Washington, D.C., United States Senator Steve Daines swore David in as a son of the American Revolution and told all about his exploits in World War II. And I was aghast because even I didn't know who this man really was. Okay? But that's not the end of the story. It goes on. Unfortunately, David passed away just a few months after that. He didn't live too much longer after that ceremony. And I think it was in June of 2016, he was buried with full honors at the military cemetery here in Missoula. And as his casket was lowered into its grave, a lone B-1B super bomber came over low and slow over the cemetery because the United States Air Force had not forgotten one of its own. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, there, thank you.
We're going to do questions, but if you could raise your hand and I'll bring you the microphone so we can make
Okay.
sure everyone can hear the question and then he can answer.
There we go.
In December 7th of 1941, I was 9 years old. Born in 1932, but I was watching a movie in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and the film stopped. The lights went on, and what did they say? Japan has attacked Pearl Harbor. I said, wait a minute, this is 1 p.m. afternoon in Milwaukee was what? 7 a.m. in Hawaii. And so I started learning how time changed latitude, longitude kind of a basis. Anyway, my own studies of the World War II was that the USA did aggravate. Remember, what did we inherit from the Spanish-American War in the Western Pacific? What did we inherit? The Philippine Islands.
Yes, right.
And we were using it as a landing area. It was a military base, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm. Clark
So-
Field.
yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So it's not as if we were, but we did aggravate Japan, an island. If you look at that map again, they had very little resources. They had no coal.
Mm-hmm.
They had very little oil, gas, all sorts of things. They had probably engineering technology. And so they were going to all sorts of places in the Western Pacific area and essentially hijacking coal, oil. And when my wife and I were in Indonesia, there were places that there was even some attacking of that part of the Southeast Asian area too by the Japanese. And so we told the Japanese, who told them? The politicians in Washington, D.C., of course, they have a hand slapping, and stop doing that. But the Japanese did need natural resources. So now I'm shifting into sort of an ecological explanation here of why Japan even started all this. They needed a lot of resources, and they were getting them from Southeast Asian countries, all up and down that whole area. We have some examples right now in 2023 of countries thinking that they own everything around them, and so on and so forth. Anyway, the Japanese, you can always ask that basic question, why did the Japanese feel they needed to attack the USA?
Because we had embargoed oil imports to Japan at that time.
But they were aggravated.
Because of their
But there
attacking
I haven't even asked the question about, but there was a sort of a kick in the ass initiation of a lot of this at the Washington, D.C. level between politicians. And then it became a military thing afterwards.
Don't we have the greatest politicians in the world? And I don't care which side of the fence you're on. You know, they seem to talk a lot when the chips aren't down, if you will. And as a very dear friend of mine whose military background says, the military only comes in when diplomacy fails. And so that's, I think that maybe is a lesson. Go ahead.
But there are some interconnections. Yeah, go ahead.
Not really a question, but a matter of history. As everybody knows, the war in the Pacific ended when we dropped the atomic bombs over there. Now, here's a little factoid that a lot of people don't know. So the first target was Hiroshima, right? And those that remember history, they go, yep, that's right.
Nope.
Nagasaki.
Mm-hmm.
So the second target was Hiroshima. Mm-hmm. However, that was the backup target because the original second target was Kobe, Japan.
Yes.
Now, the weather was terrible over Kobe, Japan, so they went to the secondary target of Hiroshima. Now, guess what happened in 1995? Massive earthquake in Kobe, Japan. Mm-hmm. Killed 4,200 people, or close. Actually, it was closer to 6,000. There were 42,000 people that were homeless after that. Now, that's a little karma that came due many years later.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I'll be happy to try to answer another question. I don't claim to be the world's greatest expert, but I'll do as best I can. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Who did you call on? Okay.
I lived over on Dearborn Street in Missoula, and for years and years there was a guy that was delivering the mail, and he'd just say hi to you once in a while. That was it. Well, I was a teacher at Sentinel High School at the time, and one time when we were talking about the 20th century and the wars of the 20th century, a guy came up to me after class and said, my dad was involved in some action that had to do with World War II. Mm-hmm. So I said, well, we ought to sit down and have a chat. And that's where I found out something about David.Thatcher, who was the most humble, quiet guy going. And I always felt like it was one of the neatest things I ever did was to have a couple of his kids as my students. And they were just as quiet and unassuming, never said anything about the value, the importance of what their dad did in World War II. Sometimes, I guess, there are unlikely heroes.
My name is Bill Jones, and I had the pleasure of meeting David.Thatcher 2 or 3 times. He lived in Missoula. I introduced him at Rotary Club 2 different times when he talked and he was extremely humble in everything that he said.
Anybody else? There, okay, go ahead.
It's not really a question. There's just a couple comments I have. One is that I knew David and Dawn. I went to Thatcher. I went to the same church as they did, and I was really pleased when I found out that David had been in the Air Corps, because my father had been in the Air Corps, and I had inherited all the family pictures, boxes and boxes and boxes, because I was the only kid left at home, so I got them by default. And I took a bunch of stuff into David and had him identify certain planes and crews and things like that. He was just most helpful, and Dawn was just as nice. They were just really wonderful people. My uncle was at Pearl Harbor when it was bombed. He was on the flight crew that day. He was on the bomber crew, but the bomber crew was acting as the flight crew for the fighters who were trying to get off the ground. And my uncle was from Hamilton, had been born in Clancy, raised in Hamilton. And when I was doing genealogy, I wondered how long after Pearl Harbor was it that my grandparents found out my uncle survived. And he was over there with his wife, with a dependent. And finally going through all my grandmother's stuff, I found a telegram, and it was from my mother on December 12th, 1941, from Helena. Margaret had somehow managed to cable her family in Wolf Creek, Montana, and all it said was both okay. And so my mother, someone in the Burns family knew my mother was in Helena dating Ralph's brother. And so they got a hold of my mom and told her that Ralph had survived. So their future daughter-in-law cabled my grandparents in Hamilton and said, Margaret cabled family, both okay. And we still have the cable that arrived that day. So anyway, just a couple trivia.
It's interesting because a lot of people, as you well know in that generation, didn't want to talk about it afterwards. And I know both my own father and my own stepfather, I did not serve, but my father was on an unarmed tugboat in the North Atlantic rescuing freighters that had been torpedoed by U-boats in World War II. My stepfather was a naval aviator off a carrier in the South Pacific who earned the Navy Cross and 3 Distinguished Flying Crosses. And he would never talk about what he did to do that. But after the research, I don't know how they made it out alive. I have no idea how they survived all that. And now my family in Ukraine, they must be crazy. They're trying to oust the Russian army, which is 6 times their size. And all they say is, we got to do it. So, I don't know. Go ahead, Dave. Yes.
Should be mentioned that one of the photographers, in fact, probably the cameraman who took the picture in your handout there, was named Bill Gibson on board the Hornet that day.
Yeah.
And Bill Gibson later retired here to Missoula area around the 1980s, and eventually went down and lived until he died near Darby. And I helped clean out his archives after he was done, and we inherited about 20 or so boxes of tape he shot about the Gemini and Apollo space programs. Unfortunately, he went on to cover that after the war. He was a combat cameraman during the war. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, we require a pre-VCR VHS tape player to play it. So until I locate one of those, they're going to remain out of public view. But we have his space program collection there. But he was the one who probably filmed the picture of the B-25 going off the Hornet.
Okay, great. Anything else? Go ahead. Please, go ahead. Anything else?
I just want to point out that Tate Jones, who just spoke to us, is the director of the Military Museum at
Yes.
Fort Missoula. And if you haven't had other things to do for this coming weekend, really, you should go get yourself out there and or spend, actually you want to spend several hours out there going back and forth, and it's all sorts of things about the war, military wars and the people who are involved in it. And Tate Jones is the one that will answer all the questions that you have. And they do have guest speakers like we have tonight covering topics that all of us would be interested in hearing. Thank you.
I just want to make a comment that we do here at the library have some resources that allow us to digitize really old formats and older technology. And that's just a cool thing that we can do to bring history to life with our modern technology.
Hi, I had a question about the logistical issues with the bomber at the time. Did you know the exact kind of numbers that they had with this bomber at the early years of 1941 and 1942, and if the loss of these bombers towards the end of the raid caused any sort of issues for the Air Corps going on?
I think you're going to get beyond me real fast here. I apologize. I don't think I have the answer to that question. But the only thing I'll say, before the B-25 came out in late 1941 or very early 1942, you could consider our previous bombers as Stone Age compared to that, frankly. And the B-25 went on to become one of the most effective medium bombers in the Second World War and was fitted as a ground fighter and everything else. But as to your specific question, I'm not sure I'm smart enough up here to answer.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Go ahead. I'd just like to say again, we have a rich history in Montana, and that includes many of our native populations. I don't know if you know, but a member of the Salish tribe, Louis Charlot, was also a great hero of World War II. He was one of the first Marines to reach the top of Mount Suribachi on Iwo Jima. And I have a friend who's still alive today who was there. But poor Louis got, if you will, somehow skunked out of being in the famous photo that was taken of the Marines in the flag on Mount Suribachi. And he was later killed saving another Marine corpsman on the island. But we have a lot of heroes we can be very proud of. Go ahead.
Plus, Charlot sailed to the Iwo Jima battle on board the USS Missoula, which provided the first flag to be flown over Iwo Jima just before the Joe Rosenthal photograph one.
How many know if we have any naval vessels named after this state right now? I hope you know the answer to that. What? One of the Navy's brand new fast attack class ballistic missile submarines just brought into active service a few months ago was the USS Montana. And her crew has named her the Vigilante of the Deep. So I don't know what that means, folks, but she's there.
I was just going to add a tidbit. Maybe you know this already, maybe you don't, but we used to live in San Diego during World War II, and the sirens would go off. That meant we had to turn all of the house lights off because radar wasn't exactly known to be good. And so light can go a long ways, but the noise from a siren could be heard in town. And so when the sirens went off, we had to turn our lights down. And you're probably wondering, what are Montana people doing in San Diego? Well, my dad worked for Consolidated Aircraft.
Oh, yeah.
Building planes for the war effort.
Yes.
And I gave Tate Jones a bunch of the military books because Consolidated Aircraft is no longer in business.
That's right. Mm-hmm. Thank you for all your input. This is what makes a story like this worth it, is when you have people who have experienced various aspects of anything else, ladies and gentlemen. Please, feel free. If not, thank you very, very much for attending, and wish you the best, and we'll see you at the next history group gathering. Thank you.